welcome to the fourth and final talk in the Responsible Conduct of Research series. Today's talk is going to be a kind of a grab bag of all of the things that we haven't talked about so far, which NIH and the Office of Research Integrity feel are important to communicate to investigators and to research staff about the conduct of research. So some of the stuff that I'm going to say will be old news to some of the people who are here. Please allow me to go on with it anyway and bear with me. Some of the stuff will be new. All of it is useful. All of it is useful to be reminded of from time to time. We're going to cover a whole slew of topics, including peer review, publication practices, conflict of interest, and the like. And we're going to do it in a didactic form, and then there'll be time, I hope, for some questions at the end. I won't guarantee that I'll be able to give you definitive answers, but I'll certainly be able to give you a plausible answer, whether it's spurious or not. Conflict of interest. Conflict of interest is a very hot topic at the federal level. There's a considerable amount of concern that the biomedical research enterprise has become, to some extent, riddled with conflicts of interest involving payments by drug companies, involving patent agreements, involving all sorts of potential inducements for investigators to fudge on the results. Now, there are two types of conflict of interest that we should be concerned about. The first of these is financial, and the second is non-financial. And before we actually start talking about conflicts of interest, I want to just talk about the kind of invidious progression that has gone in recent years from actual conflicts of interest to appearance of a conflict of interest. Nowadays, if you even appear to have a conflict of interest, you seem to be excluded from taking part in any particular enterprise, whether it be in politics, whether it be in science or anything else. Appearances of conflict of interest are such that almost anyone would have an appearance of a conflict of interest if you look closely enough, at least anyone who has anything to do with a particular enterprise. What is really invidious is the non-revelation of conflicts of interest. If people know about your potential conflicts of interest or appearances of conflicts of interest, then they can make judgments and they can adjust their evaluation of what you're telling them accordingly. If they don't know that you have a potential conflict of interest, then they can't make that judgment. So if you're an investigator and you have 1 million shares in Merck Labs and you're talking about a Merck drug, if people know that you have 1 million shares, they can calibrate their response to what you tell them accordingly. If they don't know that you have 1 million shares in the company, then they are unable to make that judgment. So what I'd really like to focus upon are actual conflicts of interest rather than the appearance of a conflict of interest. So as I said, there are two types, financial and non-financial, and each of them has potential ramifications for anyone conducting research. Let's take studies such as, first of all, drug studies which are industry sponsored. The types of potential conflicts of interest that arise are if the investigator has an equity position in a company that is whose drug he or she is evaluating. Clearly, if they have an equity interest, there is the potential for them to gain financially if the clinical trial or the investigation they're carrying out turns out favorably, because that will lead ultimately, they would hope, to approval by the FDA. But there are less substantial potential conflicts of interest. Some of the drug companies have now taken to offering recruitment bonuses, not necessarily to investigators, but even to the investigator staff, saying to the research nurse, if you can recruit 10 patients for our study by such and such a date, then we will give you an extra certain amount of money. And that is a potential conflict of interest because it gives the research staff an incentive over and above the incentive that they would normally have for recruiting to the study. And it may lead them to recruit people who are not necessarily completely eligible for the study. Somewhat further down the scale is accepting lecture fees or honoraria. This is where you get into the appearance of conflict of interest issues. Most of the top investigators in the country are called upon many, many times a year to give talks, sometimes to academic audiences, sometimes to commercial audiences, and it's appropriate for them to be reimbursed for their time and effort to give these talks. But if it appears that they're getting an untoward amount of money from, say, a drug company sponsor to talk about that particular company's drug, or to talk about a disease that uses that company's drug in its treatment, then it could be perceived that they have a conflict of interest. At the local level, accepting sponsorship of events is sometimes seen as a potential conflict of interest. Many of the drug companies would love to buy the snacks or the food that is supplied at Grand Rounds as a way of encouraging people to attend Grand Rounds. No one attends a meeting generally unless there's food available. And the drug companies know that, and they are not necessarily promoting a particular drug at that, but they are promoting their name and putting their name in front of the physicians and the other staff who attend Grand Rounds. And so the Continuing Medical Education Committee, for example, wants to know who might be sponsoring a particular event, even if it's only to provide food and coffee. So there are all sorts of levels of conflict of interest in drug company studies. Yes. Yes, go ahead. Just speak loudly.
I'm going to be giving some lectures about diabetes sponsored by one of the companies, and so is it just appropriate to say that this talk is sponsored by company X?
That's exactly what I was going to get to. The question is, what do you do if you are in that situation? And the response to that is that you disclose. If you publish a study in which you are studying a drug where there has been some kind of financial arrangement between you and the drug company, it's appropriate for you to disclose that. It's also appropriate for you just to say no, as Nancy Reagan used to encourage people to do. It's appropriate for you to, when you make a presentation, to reveal the fact that the cost of your travel and your accommodation has been paid for by such and such a drug company. Again, it's a question of disclosure that allows people to calibrate their response to what you're saying. And finally, if you're involved in a study in which you perhaps have developed a drug and have an equity interest in its development and ultimate licensing, it may be appropriate for you to recuse yourself from the data analysis of the study. There's nothing wrong with designing a study that will test whether your drug works or not, but you may choose not to be involved in the analysis to avoid any unconscious bias that you might bring to the analysis that would cause you to taint the analysis. And we've had a number of investigators at this institution who have developed drugs, and we have insisted that they not be involved in the analysis of the data, because that way it becomes cleaner and much more defensible if the data turns out to be positive. If you are self-sponsoring your drug study, you obviously have a personal investment in the outcome. It's your idea, it's your work, you want it to work, and that's where the potential for a conflict of interest comes in. You may have a possible financial benefit in the outcome. We have a study going on, or being proposed at the moment, where the investigator has proposed a certain drug therapy, and he has, because of his financial interest, recused himself from being the principal investigator in the study and given someone else the responsibility of being the principal investigator. A little bit more subtle and more difficult to deal with is the fact that if you have what you think is a great idea, it's real difficult to give it up, and you have to guard against the tendency to try and discount data which does not tend to support your hypothesis. But these are all potential conflicts of interest which can arise. What you can do at the local level is to respond to potential conflicts is reveal the conflicts again. Reveal the conflicts to the subjects that you're studying. Tell them, I have a company which is testing this therapy out, and so I have an investment in the study, and you should be aware of that before you take part in the study. And we have in the past required investigators to state something to that effect in the consent form so that it's upfront, and the subject has the ability to, again, calibrate their response to whether they want to take part in the study. You would obviously want to reveal the conflict in publications. We have, again, insisted upon that investigators reveal in any publications the degree of their involvement in the study from a personal level. Again, they may want to recuse themselves from the conduct of the study, and they may want to include an independent review of the data. Even if they don't recuse themselves, they may want to have someone else have a look at it that is not otherwise associated with the study, so that they can get an objective outside opinion. That's not to say that everyone who does a study is naturally subjective and unable to make the judgment in an objective manner as to whether a particular therapy is working or not working, but it always helps to have someone else have a look at it. So those are some of the ways that you can deal with potential conflicts of interest. And there are reasons why you should be aware of this, because there are state regulations that govern the revelation of conflicts of interest. These state regulations came from anti-kickback regulations which were implemented in order to prevent politicians from lining their pockets when it came to awarding contracts and the like. But the way the legislation was written in the state of California was that it said all state of California employees. And someone pointed out that University of California professors are state of California employees, and therefore the regulations had to apply to them. And there are very specific regulations and very specific dollar amounts about what you have to report. And most of you who are investigators have probably at one time or another had to fill out the Form 730U, which is the statement of financial conflict of interest, or statement about financial conflict of interest. And there are various degrees of reporting requirements. Some degrees are from between $250 and $1,000. Some are from $1,000 to $10,000. If it's a gift or a loan, if it's over $10,000, you have to report that. The nature of the gift and the interest in the loan has to be revealed. And if you have an equity interest in a company that is sponsoring you research, again, you have to reveal the varying levels of interest that you have in that particular company, and you also have to describe your relationship with the company. And those revelations are mandated by the state, and they're reviewed at the local level by the Ethical Standards and Research Committee, which is intended to provide an independent review and determine whether there is a conflict of interest or a potential conflict of interest, and if it's perceived that there is such a conflict, then to suggest remedies that will mitigate the potential conflict or the conflict. Okay, enough of conflict of interest. Now we're going to talk very briefly about publication practices, and this is probably more for the non-investigators here who haven't been involved in publications. It's important to know since publication of data is one of the ways that science progresses, what are the practices involved in publication? Who gets their name on the paper, and in what order do they get their name on the paper? Well, there are various conventions, by no means uniform, about who gets their name on a paper and where they get their name on the paper. But as a first rule of thumb, if you have had an integral part in the intellectual development of the research, then you should be named on the paper. Where you get named on the paper really depends on what your contribution to the research is. In general, the convention, and this is by no means universal, but it's a predominant convention, is that the first author is the person who did most of the work. And that would be like a younger faculty member or a postdoc or a medical student, whoever did the bulk of the work. The last author is generally the person who is the head of the lab. And the middle authors are people who have made significant but not the major contribution to the conduct of the research. Now, some investigators prefer to have their name as the first author. So there's no hard and fast rule about how authorship is assigned, but the predominant way of doing it is this way. When talking about publication, it becomes important to know about where the research is going to be published. There are thousands of journals out there, literally thousands, and not all of them are viewed with the same degree of respect. Some of them are, quite frankly, nothing but means by which publishing companies can extract money from university libraries, because university libraries want to be as complete as possible, and so there will be a push to get them to have all the journals that are being published. Some of them are very specialized. Some of them have a degree of rigor in their review. Others have less rigor in their review. And so where you're going to put your article will determine how, regardless of the quality of the research, will to some extent determine how well it is regarded in the scientific community. When you do publish, again, from a conflict of interest point of view, you should reveal your interests. It's common when you're being funded by the NIH to indicate where you received your support. You know, you were supported by R01, such and such, such and such. That's a courtesy. But if you were supported by Pfizer or by Merck or by one of the drug companies, it would be appropriate to reveal that too. Again, so that your readers can calibrate their response to what you tell them by what they know about your relationship with the sponsor. There are journals which are peer-reviewed, journals which are non-peer-reviewed. Peer-reviewed journals are generally regarded more favorably than non-peer-reviewed journals, although there are exceptions. The Proceedings of the National Academy of Science is peer-reviewed only to the extent that you have to be sponsored by a member of the National Academy of Science, but there's no outside peer review. If that member thinks it's appropriate to publish, then they will submit it and it will be published, unless your Linus Pauling and you can't get anything published. Non-peer reviewed journals generally don't have as critical a review, or they have no critical review of what's being published in them, and are generally regarded as less prestigious than the peer-reviewed journals. The question of how to publish is one it's always fraught with peril. How many papers can you extract from a particular piece of research? There are upsides and downsides. Obviously, from your own personal advancement point of view as an investigator or a faculty member, if you have a lot of publications, the perception is that is looked upon favorably by promotion committees. The promotion committees will always tell you that no, they don't weigh the number of papers you have, they look at the quality, but there is a perception that the more papers you have, the better your chances are of getting promotion. And so there is a tendency or a belief that if you publish your piece of research in a number of small pieces, you're going to enhance your career. The problem with that is that the papers that you publish individually will not necessarily have the impact of one comprehensive paper that discusses the entire arc of the particular research project. So there are upsides and downsides to segmentation of publication. Just to give you a couple of examples of publications and how the process works, I chose a couple of my own publications from about 10 years ago. Just to tell you, this study here was on dietary taurine in cats, and as you can see, there were 3 authors. Dr. Koppel was my mentor and was the head of the lab, and therefore is the last author. I was the one that actually went and did all the measurements, and so I'm the first author. Dr. Sturman is the person who had the colony of cats that were taurine deficient that we went and took blood samples from, and so he had obviously a key role in being able to conduct the research. So that's how that particular paper came out. And this one here, Vinton, Heckenlively, Laidlaw, Ament, and Koppel. Dr. Koppel, again, was the PI of the grant under which this particular research was being conducted. Dr. Vinton was the fellow who did a lot of the studies that were integral to the publication. Dr. Heckenlively was involved in the measurement of the visual function of the patients who were being studied. Dr. Ament is the person who ran the clinic where all these long-term total parenteral nutrition patients were seen, and so he was obviously key to it. And I was the kind of honorary author who happened to be running the lab and doing the amino acid analyses. And speaking of honorary authorship, let me talk about this paper here, because this is actually one of the more amusing honorary authorship papers. This paper, published in 1948 in Physics Review, was actually the first paper to talk about the Big Bang. And the concept was developed by two of the authors, Bethe and Gamow, George Gamow and Hans Bethe. And they thought that it would be a kind of a cool idea to get their colleague, Dr. Alpher, in the authorship list so that they could call it the paper by Alpha, Bethe, and Gamow. And since it was involved with describing the Big Bang and the origin of the universe, Alpha, Bethe, and Gamow was not a particularly inappropriate series of authors. Honorary authorship is a potential problem if the person whose name is added to the publication has nothing to do with conducting the research. And people should be very careful about allowing their names to be put on papers that they have had very little input into, because people will be judged by the content of the paper. And if you don't have any control over what's in the paper, then you're going to be criticized if you can't defend it in public. All of the authors are responsible for the content of all of the paper. Some have more responsibility for one aspect than another, but they should all be collectively responsible for the paper. Now, who is not involved in the authorship? Well, there are a lot of people that are involved in research that don't necessarily get to be authors in papers. There are technical staff, there are research nurses, and they all contribute to the conduct of the research, but they don't necessarily always get their names on the paper. It is, however, appropriate to acknowledge their contributions at the end of the paper, because they clearly had a key role to play in the paper, although they may not have had input into the intellectual content of the paper itself. Now we're going to talk about peer review. Peer review is a system whereby grants and publications are reviewed in such a way as to try and make them better and to try and evaluate their scientific worth. And it's the bedrock of all science in the United States and in most of the rest of the world as well. It's the basic mechanism of assessment for grants and publications. In grants, it involves, for NIH, it involves study sections. For other charitable foundations, it could be nothing more than the board of directors of the foundation, but there is somebody there looking at the grant and evaluating the scientific merit of it. Publications work by having reviewers who are not affiliated with the publication voluntarily reviewing the manuscript that is submitted to them and critiquing it, and the critiques are offered back to the authors in order to improve the paper if possible, or to reject the paper if the reviewers don't think that the paper has enough scientific merit. The idea of peer review is that the people who read and evaluate these grant applications or manuscripts are people who know about the field that's being in which the research is being proposed, so that they can knowledgeably evaluate what's being proposed and determine what is appropriate, what is not appropriate, what's feasible, what's not feasible. So it becomes important when you are submitting a grant application or a manuscript that you carefully present it and carefully prepare it and try and cover all of the questions that you can anticipate coming up in the mind of a reviewer. The mistake that a lot of people make when they submit their first grant is to think, oh, well, they'll never think of that. They'll never ask me about that. Well, they will ask you about that because they know the field at least as well as you do and possibly better. So people often fail in their grant applications because they underestimate the intelligence of the reviewers, and that's a fatal flaw when you're submitting a grant application. Reviewers are expected to maintain confidentiality, and we talked last week in the group discussions about a circumstance where a reviewer had kept a copy of a grant application and then went back, or two reviewers actually had kept a copy of the grant application and then went back and either used it inappropriately or confirmed that it had been used inappropriately. Grant applications are confidential documents, and they should either be returned to the agency or they should be destroyed after you have performed your duty, because they're being given to you in confidence for your confidential assessment of them. They're not there as a tool for you to use in the future. When you have reviewers are expected to declare any conflicts. For example, if they're participating in the project that's under review, they clearly should not be involved in reviewing it. If you're on an NIH study section and you're, for example, submitting a grant in the same cycle, in the same subject, then you should recuse yourself from the discussion because you have a clear conflict of interest. And the whole system is based upon the honesty of the reviewers in revealing their conflicts. Reviewers are also expected to be fair. That's perhaps asking a lot of human beings, but to the extent possible, and I'm being flippant here, but I think reviewers do tend to be fair to the extent that they are capable of being so. Of course, occasionally you'll get someone who has a particular animus against another investigator, and that's not possible to legislate against. But I think the vast majority of reviewers are really trying to do a good job and trying to be fair. We're going to talk about collaborative science rather briefly. Collaborative science is actually it's tautological. Science is collaborative, but you have to understand what the rules are before you get involved in it. Science advances by sharing and critiquing of data, techniques, inventions, and samples. As I said at one of the earlier talks, the archetypal image of the lone scientist working in his mountaintop laboratory and making vast advances is really bears no resemblance to reality. People in science work by collaborating with other people in science, by discussing their ideas, by sharing their ideas, by sharing their supplies in order to advance science. NIH, when it funds a research project, they expect that any research materials that are generated by that research project will be shared with a minimum of conditions with anyone who wants access to them. After all, it's NIH's money, it's the taxpayers' money that has caused these materials to come into being. It's not the investigator's money. If the investigator wants to invest $500,000 a year in his own research, then he's entitled to keep everything to himself. But if NIH is paying the money, they expect you to make your research materials available. Now, clearly, if there's a limited amount, then there has to be some kind of triaging, but there should not be a dog in the manger attitude that says, I developed it, I'm going to keep it. Collaboration enhances productivity by generating novel ideas. The idea that, again, that a single person can have wonderfully novel ideas constantly is a myth. People get their best ideas by collaborating with other people, by having other people challenge their concepts and causing them to think about them more. However, if you're going to get into a collaboration, you may have to have some kind of a prenuptial agreement, because one of the big disputes, one of the big causes of dispute in science is the fruits of collaboration. Who was responsible for what and who gets what out of the deal. And I remember vividly about 15 years ago sitting at the FASEB meetings, having a coffee and listening to a group at the table next to me, and one guy was clearly unhappy that he wasn't going to get either his name in a publication or access to materials for a collaboration that he had entered into, and the other guys at the table were trying to tell him that he didn't deserve it. And you could see that this was a sore that had been festering for a long time. Passions were heated, people were getting very upset. It's better to lay out the ground rules ahead of time so that people know what the deal is. Now, if you're going to be sharing materials, it has to be done in a semi-formal manner, because particularly with research materials which have the possibility of commercial development, there are institutional issues involved, as well as safety issues. If you are going to be getting material from another institution, from another investigator, normally you have some kind of a material transfer agreement which sets out, again, in writing what the rules are about what you can use the materials for. In general, the materials can only be used for research purposes. You can't go off and take the material that the investigator A gave you and give it to company B in order for them to use it to develop a commercial product that you will benefit from and investigator A will not. So there are all sorts of clauses in the agreement that will limit what you can use the material for. And it is an institution-to-institution agreement. It reserves proprietary rights. It defines limits in further sharing, and it defines the limits in the exploitation of the material. And this is not to limit a person's ability to do research. It's in order to define what the exploitable aspects of the materials are. And practically everyone who's an investigator here has, at some time or other, obtained materials from another investigator, and generally the practice nowadays is to have this kind of agreement so that you don't get involved in disputes over what you can and cannot do with the material. Now, the situation is different if you're dealing with industry, because industry is a different animal. Industry has its own agenda, and industry is pouring money into research, and it wants to get the benefits of the money that it expended. It has its own proprietary interests, and it may try to limit what you can do with any materials that they give you because of trade secrets. If they are giving you an experimental drug that they've developed, they don't want you going around telling people about how it was made and telling people about what it can do without their prior review and approval, because they have proprietary interests in it. They will sometimes try and limit you beyond what is appropriate. Never sign a contract with the industry without it being reviewed by grants and contracts. An investigator at the University of California, San Francisco got into a lot of trouble a few years ago when she signed a contract to test to see whether, I can't remember the drug, but to see whether the generic version was as good as the brand name version, and found, what was it? Okay, and she indeed found that it was, but then found that the agreement that she had signed gave the sponsor, which went through a number of changes during the course of the study, gave the sponsor the right to censor her publications. And it caused a tremendous furore. Eventually it was published, but the University of California, San Francisco had never seen the agreement ahead of time, and they were kind of reluctant to stand behind their faculty member. Contracts commit the institution as well as the investigator, so it's important that the institution knows about them. Sponsors may try to limit publication of data. That's not necessarily inappropriate if they are in the process of developing a drug for commercial use. But it should be set forth in writing ahead of time, and everyone should know about it ahead of time so that there are no nasty surprises. There are issues of indemnification as well. If you're testing a drug for a pharmaceutical company, the institution has to be assured that it is properly indemnified in the event that something goes wrong. The sponsor should really shoulder the cost of indemnification, because they are the ones who stand to benefit if the drug turns out to be commercially exploitable. There should be some agreement about publication rights, agreement about sharing of information, and clearly there should be some budget agreement ahead of time before you enter into a contract with an industry sponsor. And these are all reasons why grants and contracts should be involved in the process, because quite frankly, you as investigators don't necessarily know all the details. There have been numerous examples of investigators who have thought that they really had to lowball how much it would cost them to do the study because they were afraid they wouldn't get involved in the study otherwise, because the sponsor would not take them as a site. And then they found out when they had been awarded their contract that they couldn't do the study for the amount of money that they are going to be paid. And they had a contract, they had to do the study, so they had to pay, or somebody had to pay. You should remember that pharmaceutical companies are negotiating contracts by the hundreds every day. You may be negotiating 1 or 2 a year. They know a lot more about it than you do. Grants and Contracts negotiates contracts by the dozens every year. They may not know as much as the pharmaceutical companies, but they probably know a lot more than you do. So you should let Grants and Contracts, to the extent possible, negotiate your contracts for you. Data acquisition, management, sharing, and ownership. This is a contentious issue. There are standards for the acquisition of data, which are becoming more and more the norm, particularly in industry-sponsored studies. And these are called GCP standards, good clinical practice. There's also a movement afoot internationally called the International Conference on Harmonization, which is attempting to harmonize standards across countries as well as within the United States. But there are standards for how you acquire data. There are standards for how you manage data that if you get involved in the clinical trial, you will be expected to adhere to. And even if you're not in an industry-sponsored clinical trial, it would be a good idea to adhere to the same standards, because they've been developed as a result of experience, and they've been developed in order to make the collection of data and the analysis of data as bias-free and as free from allegations that you're cooking the books as possible. And I'm not going to get into the industry standards. The nurse coordinators have their coordinators forum, and they, along with the GCRC, run a course once a year that deals with all these aspects of conducting clinical trials. And if you're going to get involved in clinical trials as an investigator, I'd recommend that you attend the course. Data sharing is something that we talked about earlier. Data sharing is part of the conduct of science, and it should be encouraged. Data ownership. Guess who owns the data? The investigator does not own the data. If it's an industry-sponsored trial, the industry that sponsored the trial owns the data. If it's an NIH-sponsored trial, the institution owns the data, because the NIH does not make grant awards to individuals, it makes grant awards to institutions. And so the investigator is the guardian of the data, but not the owner of the data. So the investigator could technically be required to leave their data behind when they leave the institution. Generally that doesn't happen, but the institution does have an interest in proper data acquisition and in data storage. Regarding data storage, there are specific requirements by the FDA and the sponsors, for example, of how long you have to keep the data after you've acquired it. The FDA has regulations on the number of years that particular types of data have to be retained. The institution may have its own requirements for how long data should be retained. Many investigators keep their data throughout their entire career, but the institution definitely has an interest in how long you can keep your data. And then the final topic we're going to talk about tonight are mentor and trainee responsibilities, because many investigators will have trainees that work with them, whether they be fellows, whether they be medical students, whether they be high school or college students, and many young investigators and fellows and other trainees will be working with mentors, and it's good to just go over. And again, I'm preaching to the converted in some cases here, but it's worthwhile just to go over the rules. There are a number of rules that a mentor should remember when they are mentoring a young person starting out in a career. They have responsibilities to guide the person, to advise them, to assist them wherever possible, to promote the career of the trainee, to provide a suitable research environment, to critique their data in a constructive way, and to suggest new directions. The trainee is, by their very nature, someone who doesn't know it all. The investigator knows more than they do, and the payback is that ultimately the investigator may find out that the trainee knows more than they do. They also have the responsibility to tell the trainee up front what the rules of collaboration, publishing, and data retention are. So before you start collecting the data, tell them that I always have my name as the first author on a publication, or I always have my name as the last author. And if you contribute significantly to this research project, you will be an author on the paper, so that people don't have hard feelings because they've worked their buns off and at the end of the day they don't show up on the publication list. They should also be there to provide candid assessments of progress. There's no point in allowing someone who is not doing well to continue on that path without correction. It's a disservice to the trainee to let them believe that they're doing well when in actual fact they're not. This is not to say that you have to be mean-spirited and nasty to them, but you have the responsibility to tell them when they're going off the track and to try and bring them back on. I think everyone instinctively knows that, but again, the NIH says we have to tell you that. The trainee has their own responsibilities. They have to understand the rules of collaboration, publishing, and data retention. They have to understand that they have to keep a lab notebook. They have to understand that they will have to contribute significantly to a research project to end up as an author. They have to understand that they're expected to share the results with not only the mentor but with the other members of the lab. That, again, science is a collaborative effort. They have to spend their time acquiring skills. A trainee who learns nothing in the lab is nothing but a drain on the lab's resources. The idea is that they will ultimately be able to give back to the lab what they've received from the lab in terms of effort. They have to apply skills to a research problem and provide added value to the mentor's lab, and ultimately the goal is for them to achieve independence. The idea is that ultimately the trainee becomes the mentor's mentor in the ideal situation. And of course, as with the mentor, they have to adhere to strict ethical principles in the conduct of research. So I think that's the last slide. I was right. We have a couple of